There is a common misconception about empaths. Many people assume that because empaths are kind, patient, and understanding, they are emotionally weak. They assume that an empath will always forgive, always return, always give another chance. And because of this assumption, some people begin taking them for granted. They push boundaries, ignore feelings, dismiss emotional needs, believing that no matter how much damage is done, the empath will remain exactly the same. But psychology suggests something very different. Empaths often tolerate more emotional pain than most people realize, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they genuinely believe people can change. They invest heavily in understanding human behavior and emotional intention. They believe understanding can heal conflict. They believe compassion can repair distance. They often try to make sense of what others dismiss as simple behavior. Yet every human being has a limit. And when an empath reaches that limit, something unexpected happens. The transformation is usually quiet. There are no dramatic announcements, no emotional explosions, no desire for revenge. Instead, there is clarity, a shift in perception that removes emotional confusion. They begin to see situations as they truly are, not as they hoped they would be. And that clarity changes everything. In this video, we'll explore 6 psychological shifts that occur when an empath is pushed too far, and why the people who hurt them often regret it much later. One of the most misunderstood aspects of empaths is how deeply they process emotional experiences. Most people notice words. Empaths notice emotions behind words. Most people hear conversations. Empaths feel emotional atmospheres. They are highly sensitive to tone, energy shifts, and unspoken intentions that often go unnoticed by others. Because of this heightened awareness, they absorb far more than others recognize. A dismissive comment, a subtle manipulation, an inconsistency in behavior, a repeated lack of appreciation. Even small emotional neglects that seem insignificant to others can feel meaningful to them. These experiences may seem small individually, but psychologically they accumulate. Layer after layer, they build an internal emotional pressure that is not visible from the outside. And over time, the empath begins carrying an emotional weight that nobody else can see or measure. Outwardly, they may appear calm and understanding, but internally, they are processing everything in depth. The dangerous part is that they rarely talk about it immediately. They often try to understand, to rationalize, to find logic in emotional inconsistency, to give the benefit of the doubt even when patterns are repeating, which means others assume everything is fine. They continue behaving the same way, unaware that emotional data is being stored rather than forgotten. But internally, a record is being created, and every emotional wound becomes part of a larger pattern, not isolated incidents, but connected experiences that slowly reshape how the empath perceives the relationship and the person involved. Emotionally intelligent people often possess a strong capacity for empathy. They understand mistakes, they understand stress, they understand human imperfection. Because of this, they frequently continue giving even after being hurt. They continue to show patience even when it is not returned. They try to maintain emotional balance in situations that are already imbalanced, not because the pain is absent, but because compassion remains present. They are aware of the hurt, yet they choose understanding over reaction. This creates an illusion. Others begin believing that the empath's tolerance is endless, that forgiveness is automatic, that loyalty is guaranteed. And slowly, boundaries begin to blur without anyone noticing. But psychological resilience should never be confused with emotional invincibility. The empath is not unaffected. They are simply choosing patience over reaction. They are processing internally instead of expressing externally. Yet patience has limits, and every act of emotional generosity eventually reaches a threshold. Even silent endurance accumulates emotional weight over time. Most people expect emotional breaking points to look dramatic. They imagine anger, conflict, arguments, clear confrontations where everything explodes at once. But in reality, emotional detachment often begins quietly, almost unnoticeably. The empath starts observing instead of explaining, listening instead of defending, accepting reality instead of chasing change. Their energy shifts from emotional investment to emotional evaluation. And this is where a major psychological shift occurs. They stop focusing on potential and start focusing on patterns, not who someone could become, but who they consistently are. This shift is subtle but powerful because perception shapes emotional connection. This is often the moment the relationship changes forever, because once perception changes, emotional investment begins to decrease, and emotional withdrawal is much harder to reverse than emotional conflict. Most people expect emotional breaking points to look dramatic. They imagine anger, conflict, arguments, emotional outbursts that signal something has finally snapped. But in reality, emotional detachment often begins quietly. It does not announce itself. It does not demand attention. Instead, it slowly develops in the background of the mind. The empath starts observing instead of explaining. They begin to notice behavior patterns without trying to justify them, listening instead of defending, accepting reality instead of chasing change. Their emotional energy shifts from engagement to quiet evaluation. And this is where a major psychological shift occurs. They stop focusing on potential, on what someone promises, says, or could become in the future, and start focusing on patterns, on what is repeatedly shown through consistent behavior over time. Not who someone could become, but who they consistently are. This shift is subtle, but extremely powerful in emotional psychology, because perception directly influences emotional attachment and investment. This is often the moment the relationship changes forever, not through confrontation, but through internal realization. Because once perception changes, emotional investment begins to decrease naturally, and emotional withdrawal is much harder to reverse than emotional conflict. At that stage, even apologies or explanations feel less impactful than before. Many people underestimate emotional detachment. They assume distance is temporary, that things can always return to normal, that with enough time, conversation, or apology, everything will reset to how it used to be. But emotional detachment is not anger, it is acceptance. And acceptance is powerful in a psychological sense because it removes emotional dependency from the situation. When an empath reaches this stage, they stop seeking explanations. They stop replaying conversations in their mind looking for hidden meanings. Stop seeking validation from people who once made them question their own emotions. Stop seeking permission to protect themselves from repeated emotional harm. Their energy shifts inward. Their attention shifts toward healing. They begin to reflect on their own emotional patterns, boundaries, and needs. Instead of trying to fix others, they start understanding themselves more deeply. And for the first time, they begin investing in themselves the way they once invested in others. They redirect their emotional energy into growth, self-respect, and inner stability. They learn to recognize what drains them versus what supports them emotionally. This often surprises people, because the empath they once knew is no longer operating from emotional obligation. They are no longer reacting out of guilt, fear of loss, or hope of change in others. They are operating from emotional awareness, a grounded state where decisions are based on clarity rather than emotional attachment. Healing changes perception. It changes priorities. It changes standards. And most importantly, it changes how an empath interprets relationships and emotional behavior. As empaths recover, they begin recognizing patterns they once ignored. They see repeated behaviors more clearly instead of explaining them away. They develop stronger boundaries, not as a reaction, but as a conscious understanding of what protects their emotional well-being. Greater self-respect begins to replace overgiving tendencies. Greater emotional clarity replaces confusion and self-doubt. The result is a new version of themselves, not colder, not harsher, not emotionally disconnected from others, simply wiser in how they choose where to invest their energy. They still feel deeply, but they no longer lose themselves in the process. The people who once benefited from their lack of boundaries often struggle with this transformation because the old access no longer exists. The old emotional leverage disappears. What once worked, guilt, pressure, inconsistency, or emotional confusion, no longer has the same effect. And the empath becomes significantly harder to influence, not because they are resisting others aggressively, but because they finally understand themselves at a deeper level. They can distinguish between genuine connection and emotional dependency. They no longer confuse attention with respect or intensity with care. This internal clarity naturally changes how they respond to everyone around them. Regret rarely appears immediately. It arrives later, often in a quiet and gradual way, rather than as a sudden realization. It usually begins when comparison starts. When new relationships fail to provide the same depth of emotional understanding. When emotional consistency becomes harder to find in different people. When genuine loyalty and patience are no longer easily available. This is the stage where perception begins to shift. People start reflecting on what they once had, but did not fully value at the time. They remember the patience that was shown during difficult moments, the understanding that replaced judgment, the emotional safety that allowed them to be themselves without fear, the support that remained constant even when things were uncertain. And suddenly, what once seemed ordinary begins to feel rare. What once seemed guaranteed starts to appear irreplaceable. Small gestures of care that were previously ignored now feel significant. Emotional presence that was taken for granted now feels deeply missed. The realization arrives slowly, through experience rather than theory. But often it comes too late to reverse what has already changed. Because by the time clarity develops, emotional distance has already formed. The empath who once gave everything is no longer in the same emotional position. They have already grown, healed, and moved forward with a different level of awareness. And what remains is reflection on timing, on value, and on the importance of recognizing emotional depth before it is no longer available. The greatest mistake people make is assuming kindness means weakness. It does not. Kindness requires strength. Patience requires strength. Understanding requires strength. And emotional restraint in difficult situations requires even greater inner control. And when those qualities exist alongside self-awareness, something remarkable happens. The empath stops abandoning themselves in the process of caring for others. They stop tolerating what consistently harms their emotional well-being. They stop confusing love with self-sacrifice or emotional neglect. They begin recognizing that healthy connection should not come at the cost of personal peace. And they begin creating a life that reflects their own worth. A life where boundaries are not seen as rejection, but as protection. Where emotional energy is invested selectively, not endlessly given away. Where peace becomes more important than approval. That is why breaking an empath often leads to regret. Not because they seek revenge or hold resentment. Not because they become cold, distant, or cruel. But because the version of them that once gave endless chances eventually disappears. The version that overlooked red flags, explained away inconsistency, and kept trying to fix what was not reciprocal. And once that version is gone, many people realize they lost something they did not fully understand while they had access to it. Not just emotional support, but rare patience, depth, and loyalty. Something that cannot be easily recreated or replaced in the same way.